Welcome to Hope in a Dose, the podcast where we explore the science, strategy and stories behind groundbreaking therapies. I'm Louise Kearney, Forteria's Head of Cell and Gene Therapy Strategy and Delivery, and today we're diving into one of the most exciting frontiers in medicine, cell and gene therapy for pediatric diseases. Why is it so important? Well, 80% of rare diseases manifest in childhood, and most are caused by a single gene mutation. For these children and their families, cell and gene therapy offers something extraordinary, a cure, not just symptom management. Joining me today is my colleague, Dr. Isabella Presch, an expert in pediatric clinical research and advanced therapies. Hi, Isabella. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Louise. Thanks for having me.
So let's just start with the basics, Isabella. For those who aren't scientists, what exactly are cell and gene therapies?
So when we speak about cell therapy, this involves administering living cells, such as, for example, CAR T cells or stem cells. Gene therapy modifies or replaces faulty genes. So there are different mechanisms, and some of them include gene replacement, gene silencing, or gene editing. Some of the gene editing tools you may have heard of is CRISPR and base editing, and these have really revolutionized gene therapy approaches. So what we also need in addition when we speak about gene therapy is a vector that delivers the therapy to the targeted cells. A lot of times this is a modified virus, such as adeno-associated virus, in brief AAV.
Okay, and why are these therapies so promising for pediatric rare diseases?
Many diseases and many rare diseases are monogenetic, so replacing or fixing one gene can really be transformative. Often it's a one-time treatment, and this replaces lifelong therapy for patients. When you think about a pediatric patient or a kid that needs lifelong therapy moving forward, you can imagine that a single-shot therapy is a big hope and a big promise, right? So being able to intervene early in childhood can prevent irreversible damage and significantly reduce burden to children and apparently also their families, because this is really affecting the whole family. So there are associated comorbidities we can potentially avoid.
Yeah, and my work in rare disease in pediatrics, some of the indications are sort of devastating to that family and are life-limiting. So that's incredible. It's really science turning hope into reality. So where are we now? So in terms of approved therapies that we already have, and do we have any idea on what's coming next?
Some of the emerging technologies are ex vivo base editing. This is used, for example, in sickle cell disease. And then we also have in vivo gene editing. So this was recently published by CHOP, where a 6-month baby was treated for a metabolic disorder with a customized CRISPR gene editing product. And then there are also promising technologies for ophthalmology, like optogenetics, who are aiming to restore vision, which is also disruptive and really adding a lot of benefit.
So lots going on, a strong pipeline, and the science is evolving fast. But when it comes to running these trials, what's the difference and what are the challenges? What makes pediatric cell and gene therapy more complex than other clinical?
Yeah, a lot of these diseases are rare, so we have two different things to address. So it's pediatric population, which is a vulnerable population. We just spoke about the perceived benefit, because if you treat them early, you can prevent long-term complications and comorbidities. On the other hand, if something goes wrong, it has an impact on the whole life of the patient. So it is considered a vulnerable population with a close eye on balancing risk versus benefit. So what we also see, it is small populations, and a lot of times it's also ultra rare diseases that we're treating with these new treatments. And so what oftentimes happens is that the disease are not well understood because they're rare, right? They're underdiagnosed in a lot of cases, and there are no opportunities to design big trials with control groups. So oftentimes we need to look into alternative, innovative approaches, and even have to newly develop and define relevant endpoints. And so some of the tools we are using from a study design perspective is leveraging natural history studies or leveraging adaptive designs in order to address these types of things. So another topic is regulatory requirements and IRBs and ethic committees. You can imagine we spoke about being vulnerable patients. So we are treating patients from 0 to 17. So that's a very vulnerable population. So authorities and ethic committees and IRBs will diligently review all the study proposals and engage early with sponsors to identify best ways how to approve and how to move this program forward. So we see that this is critical to really find the balance of addressing the right relevant endpoints. And the relevant endpoints have to be relevant for regulatory authorities to be strong enough and solid enough to serve as an approval basis, but also relevant for patients and moving forward also for payers, because this treatment eventually also have to be reimbursed. Some of the other things that we are discussing in this specific population are schedule of assessment. Is it acceptable? Is it acceptable for patients and their families to come in as commonly, right, to do some of the assessments, or are some of the assessments too burdensome, like if there are invasive, like biopsies? We also have to look into blood volume. So when we think about babies, you can imagine the blood volumes you can draw are limited. So we have regulations. And when we engage early, what we are doing when we are preparing for studies, we're preparing justifications to really stick to kind of like the regulations, but also what is acceptable to these patients and families. When we also then speak about enrollment, you can imagine it takes some time to identify the patients first, because we just spoke about ultra rare versus rare patients. Then again, it's difficult because it affects the whole family, and it's a broad scope of age ranges we are including. And sometimes we are even starting with neonatals. And then adolescents would be requiring completely different tools to kind of like make it possible for them to join. So the whole consent and assent process is important, and we need to make sure that patients and the families get the right information and put it in a format that they can understand and really make considerations about their participation, and if they can commit to the commitment that they are embarking on by embarking on a study. And this includes also long-term follow-up, which can be up to 15 years. Another topic which is relevant for, generally speaking, in cell and gene therapy is we have to monitor immunogenicity, tumorigenicity, and long-term follow-up, which is another commitment that the patient has to buy in, and in pediatrics, also the family. Manufacturing is also a big topic, because we don't want to provide hope and then we struggle with manufacturing and bringing the patient actually to patients.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at these protocols as they come into us, what you've talked about are really some of the complexities that we look at when we're thinking about sort of what are the risks of the study and how are we going to mitigate them. And I know there are some other podcasts in this series where we're going to talk about some of those risks that you've talked about in a little bit more detail. But it's really interesting field to work in. And then we also have to think about sort of the human side behind this, as well as the mechanisms of doing the trials. These are families and people, sometimes with really young children, and thinking about how we navigate sort of that hope that we've already talked about, but also some of the fear and the logistics when you're looking at a family who've got lots of things to organize around sort of a clinical trial as well, I think is really important.
It definitely is. I mean, we know that anxiety is huge in these families and children's, right? So 75% of children and caregivers experience significant stress before procedures. So think about it from a parent perspective. You have a child, you just learn about such a devastating diagnosis. So you have a lot of things that go through your mind and a lot of stress that kind of like plays out. And then you are confronted with a hopeful and promising new treatment, but you have to deal with kind of like understanding the whole process and what it means from a risk perspective, from a benefit perspective, but also from kind of like a commitment to go to hospital to kind of like follow the procedures. So gene therapy, while it is a permanent change and so offering a lot of hope, parents and their kids are really asked to make significant decisions. And these are really in difficult times. So we need to have robust caregiver informations to really help guide those decisions with children undergoing procedures. That's why patients and caregivers are really kind of like at the center of everything we develop as a solution to address these studies and to run these studies.
And I think because this is such a complex decision, families often need support from their communities. We've had a webinar that we did on Rare Disease Day, and we spoke to a boy with sickle cell disease and his mother about their decision-making progress. And they talked about the support they needed from their community and how they always didn't get that. I think it's really important as an industry that we start thinking about cell and gene therapy and how we communicate to communities in general and make people ready for this change.
It is very important to start outreaches very early to the communities to really understand the key considerations and perspectives from affected families. Sometimes these communications can reveal unexpected concerns from the communities, which you have to address well upfront. What are perspectives on what is a relevant outcome for a patient and a family versus what is acceptable for physicians and also regulatory authorities. So yes, it is important, and that's what we see and that's what we encourage when we're working together with sponsors to liaise really early before finalizing the clinical development plan and the study designs, so that we can really kind of like fine-tune and engage early with all the different stakeholders.
So the clinical trials is just the start of this. Looking ahead to when we are hopefully using some of these treatments in the clinic, what are the big questions that we have to ask?
Yeah, so some of the big topics that are raised is obviously market access. So you can imagine gene therapy is associated with high upfront costs. Then this ties together with, we're talking about cures, we're talking about lifelong treatments, replacements. But then because these treatments are really innovative and new, we don't have really long-standing decades of experience about durability. So this is a big topic that is being discussed. So then the other topic that is really important is the healthcare facilities that are delivering these treatments to the wider population. So while the study executions, this has been playing out and developed well. So now we are kind of like rolling out how is that applied in a normal care practice, so wider populations. So while we have seen hub and spoke models, and how are we going to monitor and track the patients long term? So all these things are currently being worked out within the community, and we are heavily involved in these discussions. Another topic that is to be still discussed are ethical considerations. So we are treating vulnerable populations, right? We are treating kids, and these are affected by the diseases early in their lives. So we have to really balance potential benefits, but also risk of the treatments, right? So long-term adverse events versus potential benefits. So essentially, we have to balance hope versus risk.
So and the science is getting ready, but we can't stop there. We also have to think about how the ecosystem has to catch up as well. Thanks, Isabella, for your thoughts today. So in conclusion, today we've learned that cell and gene therapies aren't just treatments, they're lifelines for children with rare diseases and a real opportunity to transform lives. Personally, it's such a privilege to work in this field and see that direct benefit. However, there's complexities of working in cell and gene therapies, and it demands collaboration, sponsors innovating, investors funding, regulators streamlining, and as a CRO, we can take our experience across different indications and work with sponsors to guide strategy and identify those risks and mitigate them. That's our view from the CRO trenches today. If you're developing a cell and gene therapy or just inspired, please connect with us at Fortrea.com or subscribe to this podcast and share it with someone who really cares about the future of medicine. Until next time, stay curious and stay hopeful.